It's a somewhat canny coincidence that today, the anniversary of 9/11, with the huge tragedy of 2,753 people dying in New York 10 years ago, and the huge ramifications of that event as the George Bush gang sought justice through the barrels of guns. We have as our gospel text a story that questions our presumptions about what is just, what is right, and what the king, president does, really what God would do. There are some stories best described as a riddle. They're designed to make us think. They're designed to make us feel uncomfortable and make us question. And they don't always finish with, and they all lived happily ever after. And some stories in our Bible are like this. However, because they're told long ago in a different land and culture, we often don't hear the riddle. We take them at face value. And when they seem to clash with our understanding of the world, we hit the delete button and send them to the recycle bin. The story of Matthew 18:21 to 35, sometimes called the parable of the unforgiving servant, is a case in point. It's usually told as a cautionary tale. A king forgives a debtor a large amount, but the debtor in turn does not forgive a fellow debtor a smaller amount. The debtor's colleagues, upset by his actions, tell the king, and the king sends the unforgiving debtor off to be tortured. The lesson: forgive as you have been forgiven, or else. Well, this is how Matthew, the chief editor of this gospel, seemed to understand the story. He gives his own personal interpretation in verse 35. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive. Yes, you heard right. Matthew equates the king with God and tells us that God will torture us if we don't forgive. Like I said, there's sometimes you hit the delete button. Note what I'm saying about composition. The biblical writers, unfortunately, didn't follow modern ethical writing practices and provide footnotes telling us their sources. Matthew drew on many sources, both written and oral, and stitched those contributions together using his own thread, and often some of his own cloth. In this case, it's relatively easy to identify Matthew's threads and new cloth because it's starkly different from the old. Take, for example, the torture bit. The word torture appears right at the end of the parable and is the give the game away clue, if we haven't caught on by this stage. Wake up, George Bush neocon gang. You might be into waterboarding, but Jesus isn't. Jesus, like his Jewish audience, is not into a king who tortures people. Jesus, like his Jewish audience, is not into a God who tortures. It's folks like Pilate, Roman overlords, their sadistic lackeys, who did the torture thing. And despite the furnace fantasies of the Hellfire Brigade, the Christian church is not into a God who tortures. So we have a riddle here. Why include torture in this story? Let's start with the king. Traditionally, Jewish stories do equate a king with God, and there are a number of stories in our Bible like that. But this one doesn't. Rather, the king is equated with or symbolizes a way of justice. This parable is all about radically questioning that way of excessive retributive justice. Our first clue about the mismatch is with Peter's question right at the beginning. How often should I forgive? 70 times 7, says Jesus, meaning forever and ever. Yet in the parable, the king forgives only once, not forever and ever, and then he takes it back again. The king, unlike Jesus and unlike Jesus' God, is not into repeated forgiveness and mercy. Our second clue is the whole milieu of the story. Imagine grand scale revenue collecting. Imagine a super rich king, 10 times richer than Liz and all the gang at Buckingham Palace. That's what the 10,000 talents of silver is trying to tell us. You see, King Herod of Palestine, his whole annual collection of tax was only 900 talents of silver. So the king hands out the tax collecting job to the biggest bidder, who then, after adding his own percentage, subcontracts out the actual work to others. Imagine the money this highest bidder deals in. And the parable's Jewish audience knew that all the money and tax collecting talk meant only one thing: empire. Roman Gentile empire, ruled, of course, by a Roman Gentile king. Our third clue is the way the king acts. When the highest bidder couldn't deliver on his promise, the king ordered him to be sold, along with his wife, kids, and possessions. From a Jewish perspective, it highlights Gentile cruelty, since Jewish law forbade the sale of wife and children to settle a husband's debts. From our perspective, it's further evidence that the king is a Gentile and certainly not the Jewish God. Up to now, the audience is lapping this up, poking fun at the high and mighty. Oh, don't us Kiwis love that. At the overlords and at the pagan Gentiles. Oh, it's great sport. They snigger when the highest bidder, the chap we'll later call the unforgiving servants, worships, reads, grovels to the king, saying he will repay. No Jew would grovel like that. Our audience loves to laugh at those who are different. They love stories that don't put them on the spot. And of course, they, like we, are often blind to our own prejudices. The king's pitying of the servant, though, is unexpected. The audience says, forgiveness for failure? Whatever will come next? That's not justice. And so the consistency of the audience superiority to the Gentile characters is a little bit disturbed, but not for long. For the forgiven servant goes out and grabs one of his colleagues by the throat, demanding he cough up the little he owes or else. And the audience is back on safe ground. Typical Gentile bully. See how these pagans treat each other? Back in the story, off stage, other tax collectors, of course, have seen this. They've seen the king forgiving. They've seen the forgiven servant go demand money from a fellow tax collector. These offstage tax collectors are outraged. And the story's audience joins in the outrage. Injustice has happened. He should have forgiven his mate, like the king did to him. So the fellow tax collectors, and in spirit the audience, take the unforgiving servant to the king. And the king, too, shares in this feeling of outrage and injustice. Yet here at the finale of the story, the sympathy of the audience shifts. Instead of usual Gentile punishment for debts, the servant is sent off to suffer forever at the hands and sick minds of torturers. The harshness of the punishment disturbs the audience's sense of what is just. This is not like justice. Imagine instead of getting your hands tied, you get a hand chopped off. You say, whoa, hang on a minute, mate. It's like seeking justice for 2,753 people and initiating wars that have to date killed 920,000. Actually, it wasn't the torture that the audience would have found most disturbing. It was the king who changed his mind. Remember, the king originally forgave the debtor, his debt was wiped, but it obviously wasn't forgotten. When the debtor transgressed again, the king heard of it and uncleared the debt. So the theological question is not just whether the God of Jesus is into excessive punishment and torture, it's also whether the God of Jesus forgives but doesn't forget. When we are forgiven, is it conditional on our continuing to be good? If it is, bearing in mind how many mess-ups we can and do make, are any of us ever really forgiven? So this is a parable that challenges us. It asks us whether we are prepared to take seriously the tasks of healing the wrongs in our community. Like for like justice might satisfy our desire for vengeance, but it doesn't restore community well-being, and it sure doesn't make for a safer world. We need our leaders to model compassion so that by offering hope to offenders, hope is offered to us all. The story also challenges us regarding whose job justice is. It's tempting to want to leave justice to a judge, a president, a king, or a god, and then criticize them when they don't do what we want. The transformation needed to build a just community involves us all. Tougher sentences and more and bigger prisons are signs of failure. Failure to listen, failure to initiate change, failure to help one another. Yet forgiveness is hard work. It's not a simple matter of saying sorry and the other saying, "Oh, that's all right, you're forgiven, let's have a beer and forget about it." Forgiving someone who has used violence, for example, involves a process of protection, education, and reconciliation for the community. A primary school teacher once explained to her students, she took a block of wood and hammered a nail into it. She said, "Every time I hit this, I want you to think of a time you were shunned or verbally or physically abused." She pounded away at the nail. And then she pulled the nail out and said, "This is the I'm sorry." But she said, what are we going to do with the hole that's still left in the wood? When you hurt another person, you make a hole in that person that saying I'm sorry doesn't fix. There needs to be the I'm sorry, but in addition, steps to making sure it doesn't happen again, and an offering to the person hurt in order to aid the healing. There needs to be resolution, restitution, and reconstitution of the relationships. This parable is also a story that doesn't tell us what God is like. It does say God is not like that king. When the king in the story replays violence with excessive violence, it results in theological crime, not transformed community. But the parable doesn't spell out what God would do. How would God, sitting in the king's stead, treat the unforgiving servant? Would God just say, "I forgive you, see you later"? I prefer not to think of God as a being sitting or saying anything. I think of God in this instance as a transformative energy that is present when people work at forgiveness. When people work at mixing justice and mercy, consequences and compassion, in order that hope and healing happens in the community.